October 12, 1944. 7:14 a.m. Agricultural Work Camp, Sussex Downs, England. Morning mist clung to rolling hills like wet wool, turning the landscape into watercolor where edges blurred and distance disappeared into gray. Gerda Müller stood in formation with 63 other German women on dirt path that led to fields stretching toward invisible horizons. Cold seeped through the thin Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform she'd worn since capture 3 weeks ago. The fabric was inadequate for English October, designed for continental climate, rather than this perpetual dampness that made cold feel like it lived inside bones, rather than just touching skin. She was 31 years old. Before conscription, she'd worked in a textile factory in Leipzig, operating looms that wove cotton into fabric that became uniforms and parachutes and bandages. The Wehrmacht had drafted her into Supply Corps in 1942. Inventory management, distribution coordination, paperwork that tracked materials from production to deployment. When British forces captured her unit outside Calais on September 21, 1944, 3 weeks ago, she'd expected execution or imprisonment in conditions that would make execution seem merciful. Instead, she'd gotten transport to England and this. Standing in morning mist waiting to begin forced labor that would extract maximum work before her body failed, and she was disposed of. Beside her, Ilse Becker whispered, "They'll work us until we drop. Then leave us in the fields when we can't continue." Her voice carried certainty rather than fear. Ilse was 28, from Hamburg, had worked Wehrmacht communications. She'd survived the initial weeks of captivity through grim acceptance that every day might be her last, that resistance was pointless, that the only question was how long her body would hold out against exploitation. Gerda wanted to disagree but couldn't summon arguments. Everything she'd been taught about British prisoner camps confirmed Ilse's prediction. Forced labor in agricultural or industrial settings. Minimal food to keep workers functional but perpetually weakened. No compensation or rest. Bodies used until they broke and were replaced by new captures. Slavery in everything but name, justified as wartime necessity, defended as reciprocal treatment for how Germany used forced labor. A British sergeant approached the formation. He was 40-something, Gerda would learn later, James Thompson, from Yorkshire, with weathered face and hands that showed decades of outdoor work. He wore work clothes rather than formal uniform, canvas trousers, wool jacket, boots caked with mud. He carried a clipboard and surveyed the 64 women with expression that registered their condition without visible reaction. He spoke in English that meant nothing to Gerda, voice carrying clearly, despite the mist that muffled everything else. An interpreter appeared. Older woman in Women's Land Army uniform, maybe 55, with gray hair and expression of practical efficiency. She translated Thompson's words into German. "You will work in the fields. Potato harvest. Physical labor. You will be supervised. You will be fed lunch at midday. Work ends at 17 cow. You will be paid for your labor. Any questions?" The last sentence didn't register immediately. Paid. Gerda's mind stumbled over the word, unable to fit it into the framework she'd constructed about forced labor and exploitation. Slaves weren't paid. Prisoners being worked to death weren't compensated. The word paid contradicted everything. Around her, other women had similar reactions. Confusion rather than comprehension. Uncertainty rather than acceptance. No one asked questions because questions required processing information that made no sense. Thompson seemed to expect this response. He gestured toward the fields. "Come, I show you work. Then you understand." They walked. 64 women following Thompson and 3 other supervisors. 2 men, 1 woman, all civilians rather than military, down the dirt path toward fields where morning mist was beginning to lift. The walk was perhaps half a mile, long enough that Gerda's legs ached from lack of conditioning after weeks of minimal activity during transport and processing. The fields were vast, acres of turned earth where potato plants had been growing until recently. The harvest was mechanical process in some sections. Gerda could see tractors in the distance, but this section required hand labor. The potatoes needed to be collected from rows where plants had been pulled, sorted by size and quality, loaded into wooden crates that would be transported to storage facilities. Thompson stopped at the field's edge and demonstrated the work. Bend, Collect potatoes from the row, sort, large ones in one crate, medium in another, small or damaged in a third. The motion was repetitive, required bending constantly, involved lifting crates when full. Hard physical labor, no question, but not impossibly hard. Not designed to break bodies as quickly as possible. You work in teams, the interpreter translated Thompson's instructions. 4 women per section. You fill crates. When crate is full, you carry to collection point. There. He pointed to an area where empty crates were stacked, and full ones would be loaded onto trucks. Take breaks when needed. Water available there. He pointed to a large barrel with cups. Drink when thirsty. Lunch at 12 kaum. Questions now? Gerda raised her hand hesitantly. You said, paid? Thompson nodded. Yes, paid. British law requires payment for prisoner labor. Not much. Prisoners earn less than civilians, but you are paid. I explain more at day's end. For now, work, learn the task. We talk about payment tonight. If this makes you question everything you thought you knew, you're paying attention. Subscribe now. These stories deserve to be heard. For 12 years, Gerda had absorbed propaganda about forced labor under British rule. The messaging had been explicit. Captured Germans would be enslaved, worked without compensation or rest, exploited until bodies failed. The propaganda films showed alleged British labor camps where prisoners labored in mines and factories and fields, where collapse from exhaustion was met with beatings rather than medical care, where productivity was extracted through brutality rather than incentive. The propaganda had specific historical references. British use of German prisoners after World War I, stories of men worked in coal mines without safety equipment, tales of agricultural labor where prisoners harvested crops while starving, accounts of industrial work where hours stretched beyond human endurance. Whether these stories were accurate or exaggerated became irrelevant by 1944. They'd shaped expectation until it became certain knowledge. Gerda had attended briefings in August 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into France, and capture became increasingly likely. The officer conducting the session, Major Reinhardt, whom she'd never seen again, had been direct. If captured by British, expect forced labor. You'll be worked in agriculture or industry, 12 to 16 hours daily, with minimal food and no compensation. Your labor will benefit their war effort while destroying your health. Survival is possible, but unlikely. Those who cannot work will be disposed of. We don't know how, but non-productive prisoners are burden they won't maintain. He hadn't distributed cyanide capsules. Supply personnel weren't considered security risks worth that expense, but the message was clear. Capture meant becoming slave labor, worked until failure, discarded when productivity ceased. The 3 weeks since capture had been disorienting because they hadn't confirmed that narrative. Transport had been uncomfortable but not cruel. Crowded trucks and ships, minimal amenities, but adequate water and basic food. Processing had been bureaucratic rather than brutal. Names recorded, photographs taken, medical screenings conducted. Housing at the transit camp had been cramped, but weatherproof. Barracks with bunks, functional sanitation, meals that were plain but sufficient. Now, standing at the edge of a potato field, being told she'd be paid for labor, Gerda's framework for understanding captivity was cracking further. Slaves weren't paid. Prisoners being exploited weren't offered water breaks whenever thirsty. Forced labor didn't include lunch breaks or ending at 17Y. She bent to begin work, following Thompson's demonstration. The potatoes were heavy, dirt-covered, cool from morning dampness. She collected them from the row, sorted them into appropriate crates, felt her back protest the repeated bending. The work was hard, no question about that. But it was comprehensible labor with clear purpose and defined method. Ilsa worked beside her, moving with mechanical efficiency. "This is the soft introduction," she said quietly. "Get us accustomed to the work. Then increase hours, decrease food, add quotas we can't meet. Standard exploitation pattern." Gerda wanted to argue, but had no evidence to contradict the prediction. 3 hours of work didn't prove anything about long-term treatment. She continued sorting potatoes, feeling muscles wake up from weeks of inactivity, trying not to think too far ahead. At 10:30, one of the civilian supervisors, Mrs. Davies, 61, local farmer's wife hired to oversee work crews, walked through the field carrying a large thermos and metal cups. She stopped at each team, poured tea, distributed cups. When she reached Gerda's team, she poured 4 cups, handed them out, and said something in English that included the word break. The interpreter, following behind, translated 15-minute break, drink tea, rest. The tea was hot, strong, sweetened with sugar and milk. Gerda held the cup in both hands, feeling warmth seep into fingers that had gone stiff from cold morning air and repetitive work. She sipped carefully, tasting black tea and dairy and sweetness that was luxury after weeks of plain rations. The tea was good. Not exceptional, just ordinary English breakfast tea, but prepared properly and shared freely. Around her, 64 women drank tea in silence, processing the same cognitive dissonance. Slaves didn't get tea breaks. Forced laborers weren't given hot drinks with sugar and milk. The small kindness, if it was kindness rather than calculated manipulation, didn't fit the framework propaganda had constructed. The break ended at 10:45. Mrs. Davies collected the cups, returned them to her basket, and work resumed. Gerda bent, sorted, lifted, moved, repeated. The rhythm was monotonous but not unbearable. Her back ached. Her hands were cold despite the tea's warmth. Her legs protested the constant bending. But the discomfort was normal. Labor. Discomfort, not deliberate cruelty designed to break her. At 12 foes, a bell rang. Actual bell, mounted on a post at the field's edge, rung by one of the supervisors. Lunch, the interpreter called out. 1 hour. Food is at the tent. The tent was large canvas structure erected at the field's edge, with long tables and benches underneath. Gerda joined the line of women moving toward it, legs stiff from 4 hours of bending and lifting. Inside the tent, kitchen staff, more civilians, hired locally, distributed food from large pots. Vegetable soup with chunks of potato and carrot and onion, bread with butter, apples. The portions were generous, more food than she'd seen at a single meal during the transit camp. Gerda carried her tin plate to a bench and sat beside Ilsa. The soup was hot, well-seasoned, substantial. The bread was fresh, possibly baked that morning. The apple was small but crisp, sweet tart and satisfying. She ate slowly, methodically, aware that her body needed fuel for the afternoon's work. "They're fattening us up," Ilsa said quietly, eating her own meal with suspicious efficiency. "Build our strength before they start the real exploitation." Standard pattern. Decent treatment initially, then conditions deteriorate once we're invested in survival. Or, Gerda suggested carefully, this is just how they treat workers. Feed them adequately so they can perform labor effectively. Workers get paid. Slaves get just enough to keep them functional. Thompson said we'd be paid. We'll see if that's true. The afternoon work was identical to morning. More potato sorting, more bending and lifting, more repetitive labor that was hard but not impossible. Gerda's hands developed blisters by 15 sao, raw spots where shovel handles had rubbed repeatedly. Mrs. Davies noticed during her rounds, examined Gerda's hands with practical concern, and returned with cloth strips for wrapping. "Bandages," the interpreter translated. "Prevent infection. Show me tomorrow if they worsen." At 17 oin, the bell rang again. "Work complete," Thompson announced through the interpreter. "Wash hands at the barrel. Line up for payment distribution." Payment distribution. The phrase Gerda had been waiting for all day, uncertain whether it would materialize or reveal itself as elaborate deception. The 64 women washed dirt and potato residue from hands at the water barrel, then formed a line near the tent. Thompson set up a small table with several wooden boxes on top. He called names from a list, checking each woman's prisoner number against his records. When he called Gerda's name, she approached the table. Thompson consulted his clipboard, made a notation, then opened one of the boxes and withdrew items. A packet of cigarettes, British military issue, 20 cigarettes per pack, and 2 thick slices of bread wrapped in paper. "Your wages," the interpreter translated Thompson's words. 5 cigarettes per day worked equals 20 for 4 days this week, plus bread bonus for completing assigned section. Next week you choose cigarettes or other items. We explain options Sunday. Gerda accepted the cigarette packet and bread with hands that trembled slightly. The cigarettes were Player's navy cut, white packet with circular logo, sealed with paper band. The bread was dense brown loaf, 2 slices thick enough to be substantial. She held them, feeling their weight and realness, trying to process that these weren't hypothetical payment. They were actual compensation for actual work. She didn't smoke. She'd never smoked. The cigarettes were worthless to her personally, but valuable as currency. Cigarettes could be traded for almost anything in camp economies. The bread was immediately useful. Additional calories beyond standard rations. Something to eat during the long evening before dinner. She returned to the line of women waiting for transport back to the housing camp, clutching her cigarettes and bread. Around her, other women held identical packets. Some looked pleased, some confused, some skeptical. Ilsa examined her cigarettes with suspicious intensity, checking the packet for damage or signs of tampering. "They're real," Gerda said quietly. "British military issue. Worth something in trade. For now. We'll see if payment continues, or if this was demonstration to make us compliant." That night, back in the barracks at the housing camp 5 miles from the work fields, Gerda sat on her bunk examining her cigarette packet. The paper was white with blue accents. The printing was clear and professional. The seal was intact. She opened it carefully, breaking the paper band, lifting the foil interior to reveal 20 white cigarettes with gold filters arranged in neat rows. The smell was tobacco, distinctive and strong, slightly sweet. She closed the packet, smoothed the paper band back as much as possible, and tucked it into her small box of personal possessions. The cigarettes were currency now, potential trade goods for things she might need. Soap, writing paper, additional food, better shoes. The bread she saved for before sleep, eating it slowly, savoring density and slight sweetness of molasses. This wasn't sentiment. This was policy, though Gerda wouldn't understand the framework for weeks. The British approach to prisoner labor was codified through Geneva Convention obligations and domestic law that predated the war. The conventions required that prisoner labor be compensated, though rates could be substantially below civilian wages. British implementation interpreted this as providing wages in the form of goods rather than cash. Cigarettes being the standard currency because they were portable, divisible, valuable, and didn't provide direct purchasing power that prisoners might use to facilitate escape. The policy rested on 4 calculations. First, legal compliance. Paying prisoners was required by conventions Britain had signed, and maintaining that compliance provided moral authority against Axis violations. Second, productivity. Paid workers were more motivated and productive than slave laborers, producing better quality work with less supervision. Third, economic efficiency. Prisoners performing agricultural labor freed British civilians for war industry work, multiplying overall economic benefit. Fourth, post-war planning. Treating prisoners according to law created documentation that could be used in future negotiations and established precedent for reciprocal treatment of British prisoners. The payment rates were calculated carefully. Agricultural work paid 5 cigarettes per day, which could be accumulated weekly to 25 cigarettes, half a carton. This was approximately 1/10 of what civilian agricultural workers earned, but it was consistent, reliable, and provided prisoners with something beyond survival rations. The bread bonuses were performance incentives. Complete your assigned section, receive additional food. Fall below quota, receive standard ration only. Over the following weeks, Gerda learned the full structure of the payment system. Sunday was market day at the camp. Prisoners could choose their wages in cigarettes or select from alternatives: soap, writing paper, sewing supplies, additional food items, occasionally clothing accessories like scarves or gloves. The choices were limited but real. Prisoners exercised agency over their compensation rather than receiving identical packages regardless of need or preference. Mrs. Davies, the civilian supervisor, explained the system during a November work break. "We want you to work well, not just work. Payment provides motivation. Choice provides dignity. You're prisoners, yes, but you're also workers performing necessary labor. We benefit from your work. Fair that you benefit too, within constraints of your status. The pragmatism was startling. No pretense of benevolence, no claims of moral superiority, just straightforward acknowledgement that mutual benefit was more efficient than exploitation. Gerda found the honesty more credible than noble rhetoric would have been. By December, Gerda had accumulated 6 packets of cigarettes and had traded 4 for other items. A bar of proper soap, 3 pencils and paper for writing letters, a wool scarf that Mrs. Davies had obtained through contacts in the village. The trades occurred on Sunday market days, facilitated by camp administration, but driven by prisoners' choices and negotiations. The work itself had evolved. Potato harvest ended in November, replaced by winter field preparation, clearing, plowing, spreading manure for spring planting. The labor was harder in some ways, heavier lifting, more exposure to cold and wet, but it was still bounded by reasonable hours and adequate breaks. Gerda's body had adapted, muscles developing, hands callousing, endurance improving. She'd also developed working relationship with Mrs. Davies that was professional but not hostile. Davies supervised with firm efficiency, expecting effort but not perfection, correcting errors without humiliation. During breaks, she sometimes shared stories about the farm, about her sons fighting overseas, about rationing and shortages that affected civilians too. The stories weren't seeking sympathy, just acknowledgement that war was difficult for everyone, that prisoners weren't uniquely suffering while captors lived in luxury. In January 1945, Gerda developed a lung infection. The constant exposure to cold and damp, combined with work that required deep breathing, had created conditions for respiratory illness. She began coughing during work, producing phlegm that was yellow-green and concerning. Mrs. Davies noticed, sent her to the camp medical officer, Dr. Patricia Henley, 48, competent and direct. Henley examined her thoroughly, diagnosed bronchitis, prescribed rest and medication. No field work for 2 weeks. Light duty only. Administrative tasks. Indoor work. Antibiotics twice daily. Come back if fever develops or coughing worsens. The treatment was matter-of-fact, professional, identical to what civilian workers would receive. Henley didn't treat her with particular kindness or particular cruelty. Just medical professionalism that recognized illness as condition requiring treatment rather than weakness deserving punishment. During her 2 weeks of light duty, Gerda worked in the camp administrative office, filing paperwork, organizing records, assisting with inventory management. The work was familiar, matching her pre-war factory experience and her Wehrmacht supply duties. She performed well enough that when she recovered, Thompson offered her a choice: return to field work at standard wages, or continue administrative work at slightly higher wages. 6 cigarettes per day instead of 5. You're good with paperwork, Thompson said through the interpreter. We need help organizing records. More valuable than field labor for someone with your skills. Your choice. The choice was significant. Acknowledgement that her skills had value beyond manual labor, that the system could accommodate specialized contributions. She chose administrative work, appreciating the recognition, even though it meant less physical activity and more hours sitting at desks. The administrative work brought her into closer contact with camp operations. She saw the payment ledgers, meticulous records of every prisoner's wages, choices made at Sunday markets, disciplinary deductions, rare, bonuses for exceptional work. The bookkeeping was thorough, suggesting the payment system wasn't performative gesture, but genuine administrative function that required accountability. In March, an incident revealed the system's enforcement mechanisms. A civilian supervisor, Mr. Arthur Kent, 53, hired temporarily to cover staff shortage, was caught withholding cigarettes from prisoners and pocketing them for himself. The theft was discovered during routine audit when prisoner records didn't match inventory. Thompson confronted Kent in the administrative office while Gerda was working. She didn't understand the English conversation, but recognized the anger in Thompson's voice and the shame in Kent's defensive responses. The interpreter, present to facilitate, quietly translated for Gerda. Thompson is saying Kent violated trust and stole from prisoners. Kent is saying it was only a few packets, not significant. Thompson is saying any theft from prisoners is serious offense, because it violates the conventions and the payment system's integrity. Kent was dismissed within an hour. Thompson assembled the work crews at day's end, explained what had happened through the interpreter. Mr. Kent stole cigarettes that belong to you. This is unacceptable. He has been terminated. The stolen cigarettes will be replaced from camp stores. We take prisoner wages seriously. They're not generous, but they're yours, and no one has right to take them. The message was clear. Prisoner wages were protected, theft was punished, and the system's integrity mattered to administration. Gerda felt something shift in her understanding. This wasn't elaborate deception or temporary kindness that would be withdrawn. This was systematic policy, enforced policy that mattered enough to fire supervisors who violated it. If you're beginning to see how deeply propaganda shaped every corner of this war, and how fragile those illusions were, subscribe now. The full picture is always more complicated than the myths. That night, Gerda retrieved her cigarette packet, now her 8th, accumulated over weeks of administrative work. She opened it, removed one cigarette, lit it with borrowed match even though she didn't usually smoke. The smoke was harsh, burned her throat, made her cough, but she took 3 drags before extinguishing it, letting the smoke fill her lungs, and the ritual mark the moment. She'd been paid for her labor. Not generously. 5 or 6 cigarettes per day was minimal compensation compared to civilian wages, but consistently, reliably, with system integrity enforced when threatened. She'd been given choices about how to receive payment. She'd been recognized for skilled work with higher wages. She'd been protected from theft by supervisors who valued system integrity over convenience. None of this aligned with propaganda about British forced labor camps. None of it matched the narrative of slavery disguised as prisoner utilization. The cognitive dissonance was complete. Either propaganda had been comprehensive lies, or this camp was extraordinary exception. Given what she'd learned about bureaucratic systems and policy enforcement, exception seemed unlikely. More probable. Propaganda had been lies all along. Questions accumulated in her mind. If British camps paid prisoners, rather than enslaving them, what else had been false? If the payment system was enforced rather than performative, did that suggest British actually cared about maintaining conventions? If skilled work was compensated at higher rates, did that mean prisoners were valued for contributions rather than just exploited for bodies? She didn't have answers. The questions themselves were destabilizing. But the cigarette packet in her hands, 8th one, accumulated legally through work she'd performed and been compensated for, was evidence that demanded new framework for understanding captivity. By June 1945, the war in Europe had ended. Germany had surrendered. The women working agricultural labor in Sussex were no longer enemy combatants, but defeated nation's remnants, awaiting repatriation. The work continued. Fields still needed tending, crops still required harvest, but the context had shifted. They were no longer contributing to enemy war effort. They were simply working. Thompson addressed this directly during a July meeting. Germany has surrendered. You are still prisoners, but war is over. Repatriation will occur, but slowly. Logistics are complicated. While you remain here, work continues, payment continues, treatment continues as before. Nothing changes except you know you will eventually go home. Eventually. The word was vague, but not threatening. Gerda had received letters from her family in Leipzig. The city was damaged but surviving under Soviet occupation. Her parents were alive. Her sister had married an American soldier, was applying for emigration. The picture was complicated. Soviet occupation was harsh. Economic conditions were terrible. Rebuilding would take years. Compared to what awaited in Leipzig, working in Sussex fields and receiving cigarette packets didn't seem like hardship. She had adequate food, safe housing, meaningful work, compensation for labor. Germany offered rubble, scarcity, occupation by forces less concerned with Geneva Conventions than the British had been. In August, Thompson made an unexpected offer. Some prisoners can remain as contract workers after repatriation processing, not forced, completely voluntary. But British agriculture needs workers. If you want to stay, work as civilian contractor for wages, real wages, not prisoner rates. We can facilitate applications. Immigration eventually possible for those who work consistently. The offer was extraordinary. Stay in Britain? Work as civilian? The possibility hadn't occurred to Gerda. She had family in Leipzig, obligations pulling her home. But she also had skills that were valued here, work that had purpose, system that compensated fairly and enforced standards. She discussed it with Ilse one evening. If I stay, I'm abandoning family. If I go, I'm returning to conditions worse than here. There's no good choice. Ilse had already decided. I'm applying to stay. My family is gone. Parents died in bombings. Siblings scattered. I have nothing in Hamburg except rubble. Here I have work and payment and future possibility. Seems straightforward. For Gerda, the choice was less clear. She spent September wrestling with competing obligations, family duty versus self-preservation, return to destroyed homeland versus remaining in place where she'd learned skills and built work history. The cigarette packets accumulated. She had 23 now, saved rather than spent, representing 23 weeks of compensated labor, 23 weeks of being treated as worker rather than slave. In October, she made her decision. She would return to Leipzig, help her family rebuild, fulfill obligations that duty required. But she would remember. She would remember that British camps paid prisoners rather than enslaving them. She would remember Mrs. Davies's practical kindness and Thompson's integrity about wages. She would remember that work performed with dignity and fair compensation felt different from exploitation, even when both involved difficult physical labor. On her last day of work, November 14th, 1945, Thompson presented her with final wages and something additional. A written reference letter in English, documenting her administrative work, her reliability, her skills. For future employment, he explained through the interpreter. You're a good worker. Should have documentation of that. The letter was typed on official paper, signed by Thompson and countersigned by Captain Morrison, who administered the camp. It detailed her work history, her responsibilities, her performance. It was document that treated her as professional rather than prisoner, that acknowledged her contributions as valuable rather than coerced. She also received her accumulated cigarettes, 23 packets, carefully saved, more cigarettes than she'd ever possessed. She would take them to Leipzig, trade them for things her family needed, use them as currency in the chaotic post-war economy where cigarettes were more reliable than Reichsmarks. Mrs. Davies appeared during final processing, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. For the journey, and for remembering. Inside were provisions, bread, cheese, apples, chocolate, and at the bottom, wrapped separately, was a fresh packet of Player's Navy-cut cigarettes, not from Gerda's wages, but from Mrs. Davies's own ration. You worked hard, Mrs. Davies said through the interpreter. You deserved to be paid. You deserved respect. Remember that work has dignity when compensation is fair and when workers are valued. Rebuild Germany with that lesson. The journey home took 8 days. Truck to London, processing center, transport to Dover, ferry to Calais, train through occupied Germany to Leipzig. Gerda carried her bag with few possessions. Letters from family, clothes, the provisions from Mrs. Davies, the reference letter from Thompson, and 24 packets of cigarettes wrapped carefully to prevent damage. Leipzig was worse than letters had described. The city center was destroyed, infrastructure was damaged, Soviet occupation was harsh. Her family's apartment building was partially standing. 3 families shared space that had housed one before the war. Her parents looked ancient, aged decades in the war's 5 years, but they wept when she arrived, holding her with desperate strength. You survived. You came home healthy. How? I worked, in fields, for the British. They paid me. She showed them the cigarettes, explained the payment system, described the work. Her father held one of the cigarette packets, examining it. They paid you? Prisoners? Yes. Not much, but consistently. With respect. They valued work rather than just extracting it. Her mother touched the packet gently. Then they were more civilized than we were told. Decades later, in a rebuilt Leipzig apartment in a Germany that had transformed from ruins to prosperity, Gerda Müller, remarried after her first husband's death, mother of 3, worked as office administrator until retirement, kept a cigarette packet on a shelf in her study. not the original packets from 1944-1945, which had been traded for food and fuel and necessities during the hard post-war years. But an identical packet, Player's Navy Cut, purchased decades later from a specialty shop that sold vintage British goods, kept as memorial and symbol. Her granddaughter, 18 and studying economics at university, asked about it one afternoon while visiting. "Oma, why do you keep an old cigarette packet? You don't even smoke." Gerda was organizing papers, decades of accumulated documents from her work life, meticulous records that paralleled the bookkeeping she'd learned during administrative work in Sussex. She set down a folder and picked up the cigarette packet, feeling paper that was newer than the originals but identical in design. "This is Player's Navy Cut, British cigarettes. I received hundreds of these as payment for work I did as prisoner during the war." The girl looked surprised. "They paid prisoners? I thought prisoners were forced laborers." "I thought so too. Propaganda taught us we'd be enslaved, worked without compensation until our bodies failed. Instead, I was paid 5 cigarettes per day for field work, 6 for administrative work. Every week I chose how to receive payment, cigarettes or other goods. The system was enforced. Supervisors who stole from prisoners were fired. Why cigarettes instead of money? Cigarettes were currency. Portable, valuable, easily traded. They couldn't be used to buy train tickets or facilitate escape, but they could be exchanged for almost anything in camp economies, more practical than money for prisoners. But Oma, 5 cigarettes per day isn't much. That's minimal payment." True. It was approximately 1/10 of civilian wages, but it was consistent, reliable, and it transformed work from slavery to employment. The difference between being forced to labor with no compensation and being paid, even minimally, for work performed, that difference is the difference between slavery and dignity. That difference is enormous. Before you go, subscribe. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember, and why. The cigarette packet returned to its shelf, positioned precisely where afternoon light would catch the white paper and blue accents. Gerda worked at her desk for another hour, organizing, filing, maintaining the meticulous records that had been her professional signature for 40 years. The work ethic she'd developed in those Sussex fields, the administrative skills she'd honed in that camp office, the understanding that work had dignity when compensation was fair and workers were valued. These lessons had shaped her entire adult life. The measure of civilization isn't found in its weapons or its victories. It's found in how it treats those it has power over, whether it exploits power for maximum extraction or whether it chooses to maintain standards, even when maintaining standards costs more than exploitation would. It's found in cigarette packets distributed weekly to prisoners who'd expected slavery, in choices offered about how to receive wages, in enforcement when supervisors violated payment systems' integrity, and the measure of work's dignity is found in compensation. Not necessarily generous compensation. 5 cigarettes per day was minimal by any standard, but consistent compensation, fairly distributed, with choices respected, and theft punished. The gap between unpaid forced labor and even minimally paid work is the gap between slavery and employment, between exploitation and dignity, between treating humans as resources to be consumed and treating them as workers deserving compensation for contributions made. The war had taught millions that prisoners were slaves, that labor would be extracted without payment, that captivity meant exploitation until bodies failed and were disposed of. But in fields in Sussex, a different lesson was taught through cigarette packets distributed weekly. Work has dignity when workers are compensated, choices matter even when they're limited, and maintaining standards even for enemies is what separates civilization from barbarism. Sometimes civilization is measured in cigarettes, in packets distributed weekly to prisoners who expected nothing, in choices offered about how to receive wages, in enforcement when supervisors stole from workers who had no power to protect themselves, in reference letters provided to prisoners returning home, documenting their skills and reliability, treating them as professionals rather than slaves. The cigarette packet sat in afternoon light, white paper and blue design catching sun, testimony to the truth that compensation transforms labor from exploitation to employment, that minimal payment is infinitely better than no payment, that treating workers with dignity, even enemy workers, even prisoners, matters more than any efficiency gained through slavery. The measure of a system is found in how it treats those with no power to demand better treatment, in whether it pays prisoners or enslaves them, in whether it enforces standards or allows supervisors to steal with impunity, in whether it provides choices or mandates uniformity, in whether it sees labor as commodity to be extracted or contribution to be compensated. Gerda's cigarette packet testified to this truth. Paper preserved for decades, reminder that she'd worked and been paid, that labor had been compensated even when compensation was minimal, that work performed with dignity and fair payment feels different from slavery even when both involve difficult physical labor. Sometimes the difference between slavery and freedom is measured in cigarettes. 5 per day, accumulated weekly, traded for necessities, representing the small but profound dignity of being compensated for work performed. The packet remained on the shelf, memorial to the moment exploitation was expected and compensation was provided, to the weeks when slavery seemed certain and payment proved possible, to the understanding that civilization is choice made daily. Exploit those with no power to resist, or compensate them fairly, even when exploitation would be easier and more profitable. The cigarettes, minimal payment, yes, but payment nonetheless, testified that some people choose compensation over exploitation, dignity over slavery, civilization over barbarism, even in war, even toward enemies, even when no one would have punished them for choosing otherwise.